attendees. Now we have Japa Swadia and her tag domain-driven design with Elixir. Go ahead, Japa.
Hi, everybody. My name is Japa, and welcome to ElixirConf 2020. Today, I'm going to be talking about domain-driven design with Elixir. So a little bit about me. I'm a software engineer at Podium. Podium is a customer interaction platform. We help our customers communicate with their customers in a quick and efficient way using text messages. We are based in Utah. Uh, I've, I've had almost 4 years of experience writing code in Elixir. And some of my hobbies include reading books, hiking, and traveling. So let me give you a quick rundown of what this talk is going to be about. So today I'll be talking about what domain-driven design means. I'll be talking about applying domain-driven design to Elixir. I'll also touch on why domain-driven design is so important and some of the wins that it provides. After that, I'll walk you all through an example of a domain-driven design using some code snippets. I'll also share some of my experiences using domain-driven design and not using domain-driven design. And in the end, we'll have a few minutes for questions, okay? All right, so what is domain-driven design? Well, it's a design pattern, but it's more of an ideology rather than a technology. Now, the term was originally introduced by Eric Evans in his book, Domain-Driven Design, Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software. And like I said, it's a design pattern, but it's a pattern that's geared more towards code organization and structure rather than the architecture. And we'll see how. So what it is just building software that's centered around its domain, meaning the real life business application. So for example, say I'm writing a software for a bike shop. So in this case, the domain here is the bike shop, right? And what it means in a very condensed form is that is just establishing clear boundaries between different pieces of our business logic. And why do we want to do that? So the main objective of domain-driven design is to make the development of apps easy so that they can evolve into isolated systems that are manageable, reusable, and maintainable. And it also provides a great structural foundation to your application as it grows. Now, some of the wins of domain-driven design are faster iteration cycles, easy collaboration with other developers, reusable, maintainable, readable code base, and better management of complexity of the code base with clearly defined boundaries. And again, I'll show you how these all come into play when you actually implement code in Elixir. All right, so just want to take a quick second here and let you guys know why I was motivated to talk about domain-driven design. And really, it's just based on my personal experiences before I heard about domain-driven design and after I used it, and how that really made for cleaner applications and really manageable applications as they grew. All right, so let's take a quick deep dive into some of the core elements of domain-driven design. Now, domain-driven design, or DDD, it really puts a lot of emphasis on the domain itself. So it involves a lot of thought and exploration. And it's all about having the right knowledge about your domain before you start implementing. Now, we as engineers, we are usually the tech experts, and we may or may not necessarily be the domain experts, right? So, which is why DDD really emphasizes on knowing your domain well. All right, so the first element of DDD is a context. What is a context? It represents your domain. It's really what your domain is all about, and it represents the knowledge and rules for that domain. And it's a setting in which words or rules or statements would have their meaning. And just like in the real world, anything that is taken out of the context might be misconstrued. And so in this example of a bike shop that I was talking before, the context here is the bike shop itself. And yeah, that's it. Next comes a model. A model is a system of abstraction that describes your domain. And you can view models as the building blocks for a domain, and they also serve as a framework to build your applications on. So for example, in the case of a bike shop, after I understand the context and the domain, the models that I come up with are the model of a bike, there's a customer, there is also an employee or a salesperson, and there's a bike order, things like that, right? These are all models. And you can use these eventually to also map them to your data store if you want. Next comes ubiquitous language. Now, this is the common or the shared language that you would use as a team when you're working on this particular application, depending on the domain. And it just really needs to be consistent, and that can also be used across, in your naming when you're actually implementing your application. Last but not the least, there's the idea of a bounded context. And this, I think, is the core or the central idea that comes to when it comes to implementation in Elixir. And what it means is simply, boundaries within our application. Now, these boundaries are really important as your app grows. And because each of these bounded contexts in your domain might have rules that are different. Now, for example, in the case of the bike shop, you could have a context of a sale where the bike is being sold, or you could have a context of a rental where the bike is being rented out. Now, in these two cases, you're still dealing with the bike model, but the rules here are different, right? Because one is a rental and one is a sale, right? So, and if you're thinking why you need a bounded context, it's because these would help you build subsystems that are not tightly coupled to each other so that they can evolve independently in the future. All right, so now let's jump on to the more interesting part of this talk, which is applying domain-driven design to Elixir. Now, I'll just do a quick history lesson here. So the idea of domain-driven design was actually initially introduced with Phoenix 1.3, which was sometime in 2017. So it's been around for a while. And it's really interesting because Chris McCord, he was mentioning when they released Phoenix 1.3, he mentioned how they were looking for a design pattern for Elixir, because it's funny because it's a functional programming language, and what functional programming is just a bunch of functions inside a module, right? So when they were looking for a good design pattern, they came across domain-driven design, and the idea of bounded context especially really clicked well when it came to writing code and arranging Elixir applications. And this is why they decided to kind of derive that idea and introduce the idea of context. So in regards to DDD, two things were introduced. One was a new project structure, which I'm sure most of you are aware of because that's the current project structure as it exists. And the second was context. So if you look at the project structure, it's really a great indication of domain-driven design, in the sense that you can see how the web interface is super isolated from the business logic or the domain logic layer. And the website only interacts with the domain boundary, as you can see. So you can see how there's like and in the domain side, you can see how there's a natural API formed between two different contexts, accounts and sales. So if they ever wanted to communicate with each other, they would do so using the bounded context for each of those subcontexts. This also makes the code readable, right? Because when you open an application and look at the structure, it's really easy to make out where your business logic is. Now, in Elixir, they define context as a dedicated modules that expose and group related functionality. And a great example here is logger. So when you call logger.info, say for example, in your application to log something, you're really communicating with the logger context, which is exposing the info functionality for you. If you were to go look under the hood, it's actually made up of a bunch of different modules. Uh, but the way they have the logger context, it really makes it for a clean boundary. And it also makes it reusable, because now if you want to add more functionality to a logger, you can easily add it and then expose it using the logger context. So when it comes to DDD and Elixir, bounded context for your business logic are the way to go. And for exchanging data, you would usually end up using schemas. And again, to sum up here, and from the just some of the wins from the previous slides, when Elixir derives the idea of domain-driven design, there's a ton of benefits, like just easy collaboration, clean, well-defined, well-designed APIs, maintainable, reusable code base, and just cleaner boundaries within your application. Now, before we dive into an example, I just wanted to give you a quick before versus after in one of the core Phoenix libraries. And this is when when they introduced Phoenix 1.3. They went in and refactored some of the modules to be more domain driven. So here, as you can see, it's a code for one of the code generators for the Umbrella app. And on the diff on the left, you can see how it has a bunch of functions. It had a bunch of functions which were generating these different files within the Umbrella project. And with domain-driven design and context, what they ended up doing, as you can see on the right, they defined a clear boundary between the web and the app sections. And this you can see how this not only makes the module look cleaner, but now that there's a clear boundary between those two portions, you can easily add functionality and also reuse it in other places. Say, for example, you can just reuse it in the code generator for the non-Umbrella app version. Pretty cool, right? And this is, if you're curious, this is the current implementation of the web context today. And as you can see, looks really clean. It just has a couple of public functions that are exposed here, which you could call it from from a different generator if you wanted to. All right, so let's dive in. I'm going to walk you guys through an example where we can apply domain-driven design, and not necessarily just for persistence, but I could also use embedded schemas if I'm exchanging bike data through an API or between two different contexts. Okay, so I went ahead and I created context each for a bike and also for orders. And so as you can see, all functionality that's associated with the bike is in the bike's context, and everything that's associated with processing orders is in the orders context. All right, so now I want an API which lets me list all the bikes that I have in my inventory. And I also want an API which lets me add a bike to the current inventory. And now this is really easy because in my controller, I can just use the context functions that I have. And yeah, and this just helps keep that API lean. But also now I just need to interact with that one bounded context or that layer to get that functionality. Now, say I wanted the same functionality of adding a bike in like a worker that I have in the backend. And so now I can just use the same context function inside the worker without having to do anything else. So since I had everything in that one context, it made for a reusable code that can be used in different places. Okay, so now say your orders functionality is expanding. You want to add more to it, or you want to expand the existing feature. Well, that's easy, right? Because since you had everything in one context module, you can keep adding to it, or just update the existing function, and that won't affect anything else because you're still exposing that functionality from this particular boundary. Also, so a few months down the line, say your orders functionality grows in the sense that now you're processing international orders differently from domestic orders, something like that. So you can also think of maybe splitting that context into subcontext for international orders and domestic orders. In that way, you just have to rip out that particular functionality and put that in a separate context, and you would still be able to expose everything that's related to orders using this particular context. Uh, so adding new functionality also becomes easy, and not only that, it's also easy to collaborate because if you think about having a structure like this, you have a new team member join your team, they will know where to start contributing since you have these clearly defined boundaries. Also, I think writing tests becomes easier because you know exactly what you are testing, and not just in terms of the domain behavior, but also because you know that the logic is grouped in that particular context. All right, so now I hope from these examples you were able to see how you can have a code base that is reusable, readable, and maintainable. And now just a quick reminder, context, although it groups all the related functionality, it's not a dumping ground for code. So if you have code that is shared, don't put that in one context and have it be shared by some other context. In those cases, it's better to maybe have like a utils module if you have the code that's getting shared a lot, or you can think of a separate context if it makes sense. Now, also remember that context is important. So say you have a context for bike sales, and you also have a context for customer support. Now, in each of these bounded contexts, the idea of a customer is slightly different, right? Because in sales, you have a customer that's buying something from the store. So that customer model would be a bit different, and the rules for that customer would be different from the customer that may be called in for support on their particular on the item that they already have. So in this case, it's really important to understand how you would be in case you wanted to in case you wanted one context to access some logic or data from the other context. It's really important to do that in a clearly defined way, and because you understand that the customers here are a bit different, you can use structs or even embedded schemas for distinguishing those and setting a clear contract between the two different contexts. And also that also helps with validating the data in case you are exposing that particular functionality using an API. Now let's talk more about adding a new functionality. So let's say the bike shop owner came to me and asked me to add a reviews feature for all the orders that they're processing. Now, since I already have these boundaries, for me, it was just natural to put it under orders because the review is supposed to be associated to a particular bike order, and that's fine. That's all right. I just put it in there, and then I can expose the review functionality using the orders context. But now I'm just going to go a step further and think that down the line, in future, I might need this reviews functionality to be used not just for orders, but maybe also to review each individual bike in the inventory. And in this case, what I did was I just moved the reviews context into its own context instead of being under orders. And now this is great because now this can be accessed by everything else inside the app. And in future, if I think there's other applications that might also need the reviews feature, I can just pull that out into its own library or a little service. And this can be used by different applications if they want to. And this becomes really easy because we had those clearly defined boundaries in the beginning, right? So as long as you have no shared code internally, and as long as you have those boundaries, it becomes easy to just evolve a functionality into its own application. Cool. So if you're doing the thought experiment with me, and if you're thinking, should I go back and refactor everything? No, unless you really want to. But I hope this was a good direction to at least get started, or at least think about what boundaries you can define within your application and how would you organize those. All right, so this is what I had as far as the example was concerned. And I just wanted to share an example from my experience working with Elixir over the last few years. And it's that domain-driven design, it's a great idea, but it doesn't always work. And when does it not work? It sometimes doesn't work when the technical complexity of an application is very high as compared to the domain complexity. And this is very likely when you're working with like heavy platform-like applications. And to give you an example, so like I said, Podium is a customer interaction platform, and we have a full suite of products to facilitate that. For this, we integrate with a lot of third-party systems and our customer softwares to bring that data into our platform and automate messaging. So I was working on the platform for the same, and it was technically complex. It was more, initially, it was more service-oriented. We were consuming data from different sources through different mediums like APIs, message queues, filtering data, doing some persistence, and then it was ultimately applying a complex routing algorithm and routing that data to downstream services. So when I first heard about the concept of domain-driven design, I just wanted to go back and refactor everything. And this is what happened. I was super confused because I tried to think about the domain, but it just wouldn't fit because the platform was just so technically complex. It didn't, like the bike shop example, it didn't really have those clear contexts that we could define. So what did we do? We still use the idea of context because it was really interesting to at least have all, try and see if it would work to just group all the related functionality together. So yeah, we used context wherever we could. There was a lot of shared code which ended up in helper modules that could be used by the different entry points. And even though the domain-driven approach didn't quite fit, just the idea of having bounded context, it helped make the code base manageable and extensible as the platform evolved. Was it perfect? Probably not, but it did the job. And after that, I also got a chance to design and build a domain-rich application. And the way we went about doing that was, again, in a DDD fashion. We took some time understanding the domain. In our case, the domain experts were the product managers. We did a lot of whiteboarding and just trying to figure out the models. And after that, in the implementation stage is where we establish boundaries in our apps, came up with the context and see how they fit with the APIs that we wanted. And there was a lot of refactoring involved, but at some point, it was in a stable state where we could easily add functionality and also extend existing functionalities. And the app right now is pretty big, but it's still in a good state because of those decisions that we took in the beginning. So while DDD works great for domain-rich applications, it may not work for some. But regardless of that, I think you can still attempt to define boundaries within your applications. that make the most sense. And this is the great thing about Elixir, that even if you can't use domain-driven design, you can still use context to define those boundaries within your app and just make for cleaner APIs. Cool. So just a few parting words. Domain-driven design, it's a good design pattern, and it's good to have it as a mindset before you start implementing your applications. It also pays to understand your domain before you start implementing your application. And adding clear boundaries to your app makes for a reusable and manageable and evolving code base with clean APIs. And lastly, and everybody knows this, but building software is a continuous process. You need to iterate on it a lot to make it better in any sense that's applicable to you. But using domain-driven design in Elixir, especially in context, it helps that process a lot more easier. All right, so that's all I had for you all today. I would like to thank ElixirConf organizers, volunteers, and sponsors for giving me this opportunity. Also, I would like to thank my team at Podium for supporting me and helping me prepare. And yeah, Podium is hiring, so we do write a lot of code in Elixir. So if you're interested, you can check out the website, or you can reach out to me anytime you want. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Japa. Actually, yes, we have a couple of questions. We are just in the line for this, but one of the questions that arrived is, how can you look at the code and measure or identify whether it's domain driven or not?
So good question. I think identifying whether it's domain driven takes a lot of thought. Just by looking at the code may not necessarily help, but you can, if you know what, and if it's your app, you know what the app is supposed to do, right? So if you try and understand the use case, you can at least see the functionality that your application provides, and based on that, you can kind of drill in and create those boundaries. So I would say just looking at your app, it might not be clear, but I think you need to do a bit of put some thought into what your actual application is to figure that out.
Thank you so much. We have another one here. I think we'll have time for one more, and I will give you the questions in case you want to answer them like separately. Is it fine to have those hidden models under the same context to access each other, or ideally they should access each other through parent general module?
Great question. I think I would say that's more like a preference. It really depends on your domain. I would rather have a common parent module, which is apparent to the features that are related. So for example, the orders that I was mentioning, if I have like a bunch of different contexts for orders itself, like international, domestic, others, I would rather use like a parent orders module to expose those different types of modules, if that makes sense.
Cool. Thank you so much. We have more questions, but unfortunately our time is up.
I'd be happy to answer those. And I can just, I have them noted down. So I can answer those. You can also tweet at me, and I'll be happy to answer those as well. But thank you for coming, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, Japa. It was a great talk.